Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to talk about using a polarizer with a point and shoot camera. And you know, if you're using the old point and shoots with the really small chips, I doubt it makes sense to use a polarizer with any of those. But if you're using a higher end point and shoot, like this Panasonic ZS100 or the Sony RX100 series, you may at times want to use a polarizer. Now, I had the Sony RX100, the very first one, and I know you can buy these magnetic filter holders where you put a magnetic ring that has an adhesive on it to the front of the lens, and then there's a filter holder that magnetically sticks onto that. It's got a filter thread. It's a 58 millimeter, maybe it's a 55, 58 millimeter, somewhere in there. But what I have found is I don't use filters, polarizing filters, terribly often on really enemy cameras. There's specific times when I'll use them. I tend not to use them to darken a blue sky, especially because at wide angles I don't use them, because if you do that, the darkening is uneven. It doesn't cover the entire sky. My most frequent case of using polarizers is with foliage, because leaves have a waxy coating, most of them, and you know, water will beat up on a leaf and run off. That helps the leaf, actually prevents it from losing moisture, but it's also a shiny coating, and so it cuts down, it kind of interferes with the saturation of the color of the leaf in sunshine. Oak trees, they got a lot of waxy coating on their leaves, so you know, in the fall when the oak trees get nice color, polarizer really helps bring that color out. You know, if it's an overcast day, it's not as necessary, although it can make a difference. Anyway, so the thing is, and this funny thing is, I've actually seen camera reviewers and some fairly well-known ones will use a polarizer by taking the polarizer and putting it right on the front of the lens. Probably this is a 67 millimeter. Probably makes more sense to use a smaller one. Probably makes more sense to use a smaller one with this if you're going to do it that way. But here's the problem: if you do that, if you don't get this, I mean, you can't hold it away from the lens. You gotta hold it up against the lens, because what happens if you don't have it next to the lens is you can get reflections from the light coming in from the back side of the polarizer. So it occurred to me that there's another way to do this that does not involve spending $40 for one of those magnetic filter systems. It involves spending, I don't know, about 10 for a step-up ring. And so here's what I did. The lens tube, the furthest one from the body, which would be distal, closest one would be proximal, is 40 millimeters on the ZS100. So if you measure the front of the lens tube right at the front element, and find a step-up ring that is just bigger than that dimension, it makes things a lot easier. So this is a 43 millimeter to 67 millimeter step-up ring, and the reason that I bought one for a 67 millimeter is I have this rather cheap polarizer in 67 millimeters, and it's not coated, so you gotta be a little careful pointing it into the sun because it'll flare. But if you put your polarizer on this step-up ring, boom, goes on there. Now obviously if you point it down, it's going to come off, but it means that you don't have that maybe pulling it away from the lens. You can pull it right on there. The threads on the step-up ring are actually on the outside at on the small side, so there's not a whole lot of danger of scratching your lens tube, and it turns, so even though you're not going to be turning the actual polarizing part of the filter, the outer ring of the filter, you can turn it, and it holds it steady. Now, one reason to use a rather cheap polarizer is that, of course, you're putting this, and either method that you're using where you're holding a polarizer up to the front of a point and shoot, I wouldn't spend a lot of money on a polarizer to do that, because you're actually putting it right against the front of the lens tube. And of course, there's always that danger of scratching it. So better to use, and I think this polarizer may have come with something I bought. I don't even remember buying this thing. But if you look at a really good polarizer, like here, like this cheap one is a Zycos. This is actually a Calumet polarizer from Calumet Photo that I bought years ago when Calumet Photo still existed. It's much more expensive. It's made by Hoya, so you're probably familiar with that. But I would not be using this filter, to do this, because this is a really good filter. I don't want to mess it up. And the amount of times that I need a filter, it's better just to use a fairly cheap one. And honestly, if I scratch this one, it's not going to matter too much. Another thing, while we're on the subject of polarizers, is very interesting. If you look at this Calumet, you'll see this little hash mark on, and now that's the outer ring. So that's what you turn when it's mounted on the lens. And it's got that little hash mark. And that little hash mark actually is, right now, the sun's behind my house, but the sun's over there. So right now, actually, if I were taking a picture of, say, the blue sky to the north, I wouldn't even have to look through the viewfinder to align this on the lens. You simply take that hash mark and you point it in the direction of where the sun is. If you're shooting into the sun, let's say the sun's right up there, you put it up. And that won't do much for the sky, but it will still cut the glare off of foliage. Now this cheap polarizer, it's actually got the logo and such on the outer ring, and it doesn't have a hash mark. So essentially, if you get something like this, you're going to have to test it. What I found is that, it says Japan Optics here, I found that that hash mark should be somewhere right around the word optics, so close enough. Also, you probably can tell this. This cheap one is, again, I mentioned, not coated. This is, I believe, multi-coated. Yep, you can see this one's multi-coated, and you can tell because you can see how different the reflection is. This does not reflect a lot. So flare isn't going to be as much of a problem if you point this into the sun when it's attached to your lens. So anyway, I'm going to do a follow-up video going into when you use a polarizer and when you might not want to, and I'm going to cover a few of the things I mentioned here. But this is it for today. If this was helpful to you, please like it. That's a big help to me. So pop that like button. Any questions and comments, any other kind of interesting ideas you've come up with in your photography to help you do things simply, pop them down below. And if you're a subscriber, I appreciate it. Thank you very much. I'm Todd Banner, and I will see you next time.